did a study in south central Pennsylvania, northern Maryland, and they found that 70% of the wells they sampled had total coliform bacteria. That's one of our indicator organisms for microbial contamination. And of those, 1/4 of the wells they sampled had fecal coliforms. They're the things that will make you sick, the fecal coliforms, of which E. coli, which I'm sure you've heard of, that's one of the fecal coliforms. So proper well construction in a rural area is very important. It's kind of hard to retrofit a well once it's already in the ground. So if anybody's involved with developing a new water supply at your home, I would encourage you to pay the little bit extra it costs to have it grouted. It's really not a whole lot more. Basically, the main cost when you're drilling a well is the fee to have the rig mobilized and brought to your site. So if you have to shell out a couple hundred extra dollars to have that thing grouted, I think it's worth it in the long run, because you won't have to worry about shock chlorinating your well every couple of months or installing some type of treatment because you have microbial contamination. And I do want to also mention that Adams County, which has established a Water Resource Advisory Committee to advise the commissioners on water issues. One of the things they've been working on is that they're drafting a set of water well construction standards for Adams County. So it's possible that Adams might join some of these counties that have construction standards. I probably should also mention that certain municipalities do have their own. I believe Washington Township in Franklin County has some, and I know South Middleton, I believe, in Cumberland has some. Carroll Valley Borough, Cumberland Township, and Adams County, Strabane Township, they have them. So some municipalities across the state do have these things, but there's nothing at the state level. One of the ways that you can deal with some of these types of contaminants, particularly associated with agricultural activities, is through the use of agricultural best management practices, which improve water quality. And here we have a depiction of a before and after pictures related to a stream crossing. Obviously, if you have cattle walking right through a water body, not only are they going to muck it up and mess up the bank and cause a lot of erosion and siltation, but there's a good chance, if you've ever driven by out in the country and you've seen cows standing in the water, if they're standing there for any length of time, they're probably going to end up doing their business in the creek or the stream, and that's just extra source of nitrogen, extra source of potential pathogens through bacteria. So if we can keep animals out of the stream, either by fencing off the banks or by putting in these crossings, which allow the cattle to walk across that without being in contact with the water, we're going to be a lot better off. And one of the reasons why, and maybe to make it even more of an issue, is if we look at public water supplies in Pennsylvania. This is data looking at groundwater sources used by public water systems in Pennsylvania. These are nitrate results greater than 8 milligrams per liter, so these are just under the drinking water standard. You can see that there's a fair amount in our area, particularly like York, Adams, some Cumberland, a few in Franklin. But you'll see the vast majority of them are clustered in Lancaster and Chester County. Lancaster County is almost exclusively carbonate rocks. It's an area of intensive agricultural operations, and unfortunately it has the limestone geology, so it's just has some really good soils. It's some of the best. In fact, I think I've heard it's the most productive non-irrigated farmland in the U.S., but unfortunately the groundwater there is just chock full of nitrates. So there's been a kind of a push coming at the national level for state drinking water programs and source water protection programs to partner with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service to collaborate on prioritizing some of these areas, or at least considering drinking water areas as they fund and implement agricultural BMPs. And if we looked at nitrate violations in Pennsylvania, this map would look very similar to that. Most of our nitrate, in fact, the vast majority of our nitrate violations for public water systems occur in Lancaster County. And having mentioned something about drinking water sources and public water systems, I'd like to briefly mention the Source Water Protection Program. And what source water protection is, it's efforts to protect the raw water quality of drinking water sources, whether they're wells, springs, intakes on streams or reservoirs that are used by public water systems, especially community water systems. There's actually two different classes of public water systems. You're probably all familiar with the community water system. Shippensburg Borough Authority, that's an example of a public water system. Harrisburg Water Department, Gettysburg Municipal Authority, Chambersburg Water Department, they're all community water systems. There's another class referred to as non-community public water systems. These would be facilities, and they generally have wells like restaurants, motels, campgrounds, schools, factories that have their own water supply that aren't supplied by a community system. These are what's known as non-community water systems. Right now, we're only focusing this effort on community water systems to get the biggest bang for the buck, but the whole idea relies on the old adage of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's the first barrier to drinking water contamination, and obviously, if we can prevent that from becoming contaminated in the first place, it's going to save public funds and the investment made in those sources. And not only that, it's going to protect public health and promote sound land use planning. But let's face it, public health protection and sound land use planning sounds pretty altruistic. What really matters is the bottom line, and if we look at some studies that have been done, one involved Gettysburg Municipal Authority, which had one of their wells contaminated by dry cleaning fluids in the late 80s. The water system incurred a lot of money, and actually it was at the time the Department of Environmental Resources incurred a lot of money responding to contamination of this well. EPA did a study looking at comparing the costs associated with developing a protection program versus the cost of dealing with contamination, and they found that responding to contamination can cost as much as 200 times the prevention efforts. The American Water Works Association actually did a study where they looked at this too, and they came up with an average that the average cost-benefit ratio was 15 or 16 to 1, which actually does bear out that old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if we look at surface water, this sort of underscores the importance of riparian forest buffers. For every 10% increase in forest cover, drinking water treatment costs decreased by 20%. So I think all the efforts related to buffers is a great idea, and it's certainly going to do not only the environment some good, but it will hopefully save some local resources by maintaining or perhaps even improving water quality used for drinking water sources. In Pennsylvania, we perform source water assessments as mandated by the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act on all our public water systems, both community and non-community sources. And we had to report to EPA a few years ago what the most threatening and the most prevalent contaminants were, or at least activities, contaminating activities. And these are arranged by groundwater and by surface water, with the most common and the most threatening. As you can see, there's some pretty common themes between all the categories. And before I came up here, I just took a look at the summary assessment results for Shippensburg, Carlisle, Chambersburg, and Gettysburg, and lo and behold, probably the highest protection priorities that were identified in the source water assessments for those water systems related to agriculture, transportation corridors, and things like that. So even though this is a statewide compilation, it sort of is borne out at the local level, even though you couldn't go to any particular water supply and say, okay, this is what you need to worry about. It's going to be site-specific. But nonetheless, agriculture showed up as a very common concern with these source water assessments. The reason the source water assessments were done is it identified the contributing area to these water sources. It inventoried the contaminants. Then we did a susceptibility determination to determine how susceptible these things were, basically arrived at a protection priority, said, in other words, these are the bigger threats you need to worry about. Then we provided these things to the water system. It was designed to be the skeletal framework for them to take the next step, which is voluntary, and that's to develop a source water protection program. As I said, it's voluntary, but many communities across Pennsylvania are implementing these. There's probably about 300 to 400 systems that have a substantially implemented source water protection program at this point in Pennsylvania. And some of them even involve ordinances. We have about 24 communities in Pennsylvania that have adopted ordinances, generally a zoning type ordinance or an wellhead protection overlay type ordinance to protect their wells. I'd also like to mention that Shippensburg Borough Authority does have a DEP approved wellhead protection program, as does Washington Township Municipal Authority in Franklin County, and I think we'll be hearing from one of their officials on the panel later on. So we do have a fair amount of source water efforts going on in the area. Biglerville in Adams County just received approval for one, and Gettysburg is interested in developing one also. In terms of quantity issues, as I said, my forte is more groundwater quality and groundwater protection, but I did want to try to mention some issues related to water use and water quantity issues. And some of them involve things like, as you'd expect, intensive growth and development, and some of the things you need to worry about there would be well interference or perhaps interference with existing water sources, not just another well, but you could be depleting a stream somewhere by sucking out too much groundwater. Loss of recharge. When we pave everything over, we lose groundwater recharge. There's also evidence that once an area has about more than 10% impervious cover, we start seeing water quality degrading. We also see exceedance of sustainable yields in these areas, and you might also have unknown or unregulated groundwater use in these areas just because things are growing so fast and people may not be fully aware of what they need to do, or things didn't get caught up to what the rules are. Quarrying can be an issue. You have to worry about extensive aquifer dewatering. It could also be an issue opening up sinkholes at times, which happened down in Hanover Borough, or in Conewaga Township, which is where some of Hanover Borough's sources are. They were trying to develop a water supply well. There's a big rainstorm. The quarry's doing a lot of dewatering there, and they actually had a drill rig sink into a sinkhole there. In fact, it was a great picture in the evening sun. It had a drill rig almost on its side with the mask like this, and the thing sinking down into the ground. I'm going to have to get a picture of that. Intensive water use in small basins or drought impacts, sort of the same thing. You need to worry about loss of base flow, that groundwater that's discharging to the streams and maintaining the stream flow. Or you can get loss of perennial stream flow also with too much water use or prolonged droughts. Droughts here in Pennsylvania seem to run in a cycle. The last really bad one we had, I think, was around 2002. They seem to run in cycles of about 10 to 12 years. So fortunately, we kind of lucked out this year, but you never know what's going on, and you always need to be worried about that or be prepared for that if you're a water resource manager. Consumptive water use, that can be an issue. Water is being used and sent off somewhere else, like bottled water, things like that. You might have to worry about augmenting flow sometimes. Certain water systems that withdraw water from streams, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission may have requirements that during parts of the year where you're sucking out so much water and the stream flows a trickle below your intake, that you have some way to augment that flow so that you're not negatively impacting aquatic organisms. There's also the issue of, I forgot to mention it earlier, but we're kind of split in this area between two major drainage basins. Part of the area drains to the Susquehanna, and part of it drains to the Potomac. About half of Adams County drains to the Potomac. About 3/4 of Franklin drains to the Potomac. The other parts drain to the Susquehanna. Just about all of Cumberland County drains to the Potomac, or the Susquehanna. So the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, they do a very good job and have some very strict regulations regarding the regulation of groundwater withdrawals and how much quantity that you're allowed to use. Unfortunately, in the Potomac Basin, it's wide open. There is no regulation of groundwater quantity by the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. Also, one other issue in the area might be interbasin diversions or watershed transfers. Essentially, this is a consumptive use, and as some of you may know, Gettysburg is considering a possible diversion to take Susquehanna River water piped from York Water to Gettysburg, which would then end up being discharged eventually from their wastewater plant on Rock Creek, which goes to the Potomac. Some people in the Susquehanna are sort of concerned about that. Some folks in the Potomac, when they heard about it, they thought it was a great idea because they're getting more water. So it's a very complicated, very somewhat controversial situation, but these are some of the issues that are going on. Regarding other quantity issues, Pennsylvania does have a state water plan. It was adopted a few years ago. The legislation was set up in 2002, and this is the first update to the state water plan in, I think it was 20-some years. And one of the things that the state water plan allowed for was for the identification of critical water planning areas. And these are areas where the current use or the projected use the current demand or the projected demand, I have it backwards, the current or existing demand use is going to exceed the demand at some point. So they had a very complicated analytical process to develop procedures to identify these areas. The areas in white here are the ones that were nominated for these critical water planning areas, and you can see there was a good portion of those were in this area that, within South Mountain. There's a good chunk of Adams, good chunk of Franklin that were considered or nominated for these critical water planning areas. What happened is 3 of these areas were actually designated as critical water planning areas. 2 are in western Pennsylvania in the Ohio Basin. The other one is down in Adams County. The Marsh and Rock Creek were combined into one sub-basin, and that was designated a critical water planning area. And what that means is a critical area resource plan is then developed for these areas where they would try to come up with recommendations for how to ensure that the demand that the current or existing uses won't exceed the demand for water. In Pennsylvania, this is kind of a novel concept. There is a CARP underway for the Marsh and Rock Creek basins right now. The Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin actually has a contract to develop this plan. I believe there's a public meeting related to this thing sometime in December. I think it's December 6th in Gettysburg. But there's opportunities to comment on this plan. The plan's available online. But one thing I want to point out, Adams County in particular is a really very stressed and challenged area when it comes to water. It's what's referred to as a headwaters area. So there's not any big streams flowing into the county. They rely solely on precipitation for their source of water. And as you can see from this area, there's both water-stressed and water-challenged areas. The water-challenged areas relate to the actual hydrogeologic conditions that may preclude the development of large-scale water resources. Some of those are that diabase that I mentioned, the notoriously poor aquifer, and not only is it a bad aquifer, it also acts as a barrier to groundwater flow. So even though you might be able to develop a well within the sandstones and shales away from that diabase, you're going to be somewhat limited in the long term because that rock is so dense and impermeable, it's going to act as a barrier, and it's going to limit the amount of water that you'll be able to successfully produce in that area. The fruit belt in Adams County is also a concern due to consumptive water use. And I guess I should mention with this map, originally came from the Susquehanna River Basin Commission's 2005 groundwater management plan, where they developed these stressed and challenged areas. The Susquehanna would be the stuff on the top part of Adams County is the Susquehanna Basin. The stuff below that's the Potomac. In 2010, the Potomac Basin took this map, and because geology and water resources do not follow political boundaries, they extended logically these different areas into the Potomac Basin. As you can see, I think it's almost 40% of Adams County is either in a stressed or a water-challenged area. So they definitely have some issues down there. Hence, that's why the county commissioners appointed a Water Resource Advisory Committee. On this map, the green depicts the stressed areas, and the blue